mechanical concrete, a mechanical concrete system like this.
Harry, I
So,
just decided to turn the record on because people will love this. Go ahead, please.
oh, sure. So, for the recording, this is a hyperbolic paraboloid. Let me go to the actual geometry. And the hyperbolic paraboloid will be built on top of a mechanical concrete system. Mechanical concrete was developed for making roadways. And what they found is when you make a road using this type of grid pattern, you can also do it with a grid membrane, but this is an inexpensive way of doing it using tires that you recycle. So you're getting the benefit of recycling the tires, and you're getting a very stable platform because these tires will be ring shanked, nailed together, making a grid. Let me see. I don't know if I have an image of the tires alone. No,
Wow.
and the benefit is a very stable platform. Now, there's a twofold a reason for me to do this. In my area, I'll be able to immediately clear the brush that's around. There's just grass and bushes. And when you clear the ground of grass and bushes, you have your soils already at its maximum compaction. So you don't have to dig any trenching or anything, and your soil is already where you want it to be. So you just lay these tires down, fill them with gravel, and then you would build your slab and ring beam around these tires and across the tires for your slab. And this elevates you and gives you an extremely stable platform. If there were any serious flooding that came through, which there wouldn't be in this area, but if you were in an area where there was serious flooding, a lot of times the ground or gravel might get washed away. That won't happen in this case because of the steel belts.
And
Now,
that
in the
also
case of
much reduces your cost of foundation, I would think.
yes, massively, and it's extremely stable. It's very strong platform. And like I mentioned, these interior walls, all of this could be just one open floor plan because building domes and hyperbolic paraboloid shapes don't require any interior structural walls. And so that's great for just designing whatever you want. And in this particular design, I have window seals. These windows are designed to be 7 feet wide and 5 feet tall, with a 2 foot ledge there that you can sit on or lay down in, and just enjoy in this case, the beautiful mountains in the area. And you have plenty of sunlight coming in. And so, anyway, this is a design I'm going to be building soon for a flip, actually. And I'll be documenting the process on my YouTube channel. And then once everything's been completed, this will be offered for sale. To me, it's a unique structure. It's not many structures that look like this using this hyperbolic paraboloid geometry. And in case anyone doesn't know, the hyperbolic paraboloid just means it's like a Pringles chip or a horse saddle. You have a curve in two directions that makes it extremely strong.
For
And
everyone just joining us, this is the famous Aircrete Harry, who's does the Aircrete concrete. But Aircrete Harry is also famous for his work with the Schauberger Vortex, and the Vortex is the subject of this evening. So, Aircrete, would you like to give them 2 minutes on your work with Vortex work also, or
yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have a ton of. I wasn't prepared to
yeah, just tell a
demonstrate
story.
that.
Yeah,
But what I do have is I created airforms in the shape of an egg, and there are two airforms that I have made. One is 35 feet by, I mean, 35 inches by 45 inches, and this is to make an egg-shaped tank for holding your water, where you would have an impeller at the bottom to spin the water. And this way, your water is being structured. And the actual idea came from an image that Dan showed showing an experiment that was done once where they were spinning water at high speeds.
yes,
So, in actuality, the inside of the tank will be gold leaf coated. I'm
that's it.
sorry, silver leaf coated, and the exterior will be gold leaf. And the idea behind that is the silver will retain energy and the gold will reflect the energy so that you, uh, if especially if you're in an environment where there's a lot of electro fog,
Yeah.
your
And
water won't be
the
affected
gold is the
because
right dielectric. The original 50,000 RPM flat, non-fractionated impeller at the bottom of Vortex egg from Implosion Research Dolly in UK. And this actually made healing environments. And Aircrete was brave enough to build it. It's cool.
yes, and so it's really exciting. And then the second airform, and by the way, the tanks, I will be showing those at a later date. The tanks have a lot of quartz mixed into the cement. In the future, I will be making out of a geopolymer cement, but currently, the technology is not quite there yet for me to experiment with the geopolymers.
But so the
So the
container is high dielectric implosive, like with the quartz, et cetera. And then you have the gold, the frame, which has the right super dielectric, meaning the liquid is a capacitive piezo. And this is a charged vortex making gravity, the subject of this evening.
and it's amazing. The technology's simple, and so I did the same thing with a large airform, which I've showed in the past. The
Yes.
airform is also 8 feet diameter by 11 feet tall, egg
Oh, wow.
shaped. And that idea, when I had that design, was to dig a hole that was slightly larger than the airform. Then I could place the airform in that hole and again fill the cavity with a high quartz cement mix to make myself an underground cistern tank for my water.
Charging.
Now, the geometry of the egg shape will help to keep the water in constant movement because of the temperature difference of the water touching the walls of the shell to the temperature of the water at the center of the tank will cause a natural circulation being we're in an egg-shaped geometry.
That's right. There's a
And so now,
leaping effect. That temperature differential starts a vortex turning.
yes. And so now you don't have to worry about your water becoming stagnant
Right.
and it's being charged for you. And then you can go the extra step. And what I haven't done yet, what I'm going to, because I saw a recent experiment, was the impeller that was found in Egypt works incredible for creating vortex of water. If you spin that impeller, I was going to use the Tesla impeller until I saw a demonstration of this impeller that was found in Egypt.
I remember.
Works amazingly for
Yes.
creating a vortex in the
Because you
water
need
as well.
non-fractionating, and that makes it implosive. So it's smooth, where the Tesla turbine was also flat. So there's a
And
whole subject here of how you make an implosive vortex, a charged vortex becomes centripetal. And the thing about Aircrete Harry, he's brave enough, he's got the gadgets and the toys and the equipment's been doing this and understands high dielectric. So thank you, Aircrete. We need to do more with your pictures of that later. That was so cool. Thank you.
yeah, I'll definitely get something together for another day and really give you guys a demonstration.
Super, super. I was talking to Scott the other day, Earth in Hand. He was talking to me about working with you, and everybody loves it. It's all cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, this is super. So this is a perfect intro to what we're talking about tonight, how a charged vortex makes gravity. I'm Dan Winter, fractalu.com, fractalfield.com. And Tufan, I already turned on the recording and the YouTube because Harry was so much fun. I just couldn't resist.
Great.
So we are going to do a little intro, but I think first, actually, maybe we'll start with announcements. Should we go ahead with the announcements, Tufan? Would you like?
Sure, of course. Let's start with next week's lecture. Next week, we are going to have Casey House with us. He will be talking about geometric principles of synergetics, lifelong work of Buckminster Fuller. And Casey is also the great graphic designer, artist who helps us creating geometric models posters. And he recently finished one poster for geometric models focused on synergetics. And I would like to show you that poster now. I'm going to share my screen now for a second.
In the lineage of geometricmodels.org series of the best sacred geometry posters, this one featuring the Bucky Fuller work.
Right. So this is the poster that Casey House designed, which talks about the synergetics work
And the
with
jitterbug
key
charge
at the
collapse right
bottom.
there.
Right. You can find so many geometric relationships, principles focused on Buckminster Fuller's synergetics work here. And this is available at geometricmodels.org. And we would like to thank Casey House Synergetics University for preparing this for geometric models. And I'll stop share. And also, this year, again, we are doing the 5th International South France Conference, and we have a great lineup of lectures and events. A few of them are being practical workshops, which I will give a few examples from. Professor Ralph Otterpole will be doing practical work about working with geomancy in gardening and agriculture, which is a practical workshop in the garden. And then we will have practical introduction to energy medicine with Lisa Morrissey, and another practical family constellation workshop with Carlos Avila, and another hands-on workshop, sauerkraut preparation together. It's powerful making food together where everyone's hands add their own life force to the mixture. So this will be done.
Alchemy of
Yeah.
fermentation. Sorry, too fun. Yeah.
Right, right. So this will be presented by Austin Duran. So these are the practical workshops in addition to the lecture, the theoretical lectures that we have already in the program. And you can find the details at fractalfield.com/2025, early bird ending the 1st of June. And I think these are it. These are all from me. And you can continue then.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Tufan for having the organization and the discipline for getting this conference together. I could never do this by myself. It's great. Remember,
it's a pleasure. Thank you.
fractalfield.com/2025. The program is now there. The speakers are there. And we had so much fun last year. And now we're adding more practical hands-on, get in there, get outside, have fun, hands-on, interactive. We're adding that element. And with our incredible catering and environment, why, this is going to be super fun, guys. Anywho, come if you can. South France, October 9 to 14. Fun, fun, fun.
Tons of bonuses.
Yes. So let's see. Tonight's lecture about how a charged vortex makes gravity, electrogravitics, essentially. We suggest that this is actually the only way to understand the power of mind and the power to make a soul, the stuff you take with you through death. All starts with the ability to understand how a charged vortex makes gravity become centripetal. But actually, there's one more little warm-up intro I have to do here. There's a short story I have to tell. And this has to do with, it's a device that also makes charged vortex implode. It's called PhiRay.com. We had a phone call this past week. Our first introductory launch PhiRay customer, San Diego, Randy, amazing, wonderful guy. Well, he calls me just out of the blue and says, I need to order a second unit. I says, okay. Apparently, he had such an amazing experience with his older mother, helping her with all kinds of, problems, and immediately needed one for his mother, which was wonderful. It's an honor, But then a few days later, his sister Lori calls me, and she is the ultimate horse whisperer. Lori around San Diego, and she's about to send us this ride, but she had this story to tell. So first of all, like many, not all, but many people are somewhat sensitive in the presence of a strong longitudinal coherence field begins to have what we call clairvoyance-like phenomena, that when you close your eyes, you begin to realize that if you start to pay attention and see through your inner eye, you realize that your body itself is becoming transparent. And you can see the energy centers inside your body as if they're transparent and see where the slip knots are. This is a form of the medical intuitive. And we think that this onset of implosive longitudinal array coupling is absolutely the physics of clairvoyance, which we also believe is related to the physics of why this electrical form of compression replicably triggers lucid dreaming. So and actually it was Nicholas, our genius engineer builder, who first talked to me about, well, all you do is you hold this magnetic coil, which is the strongest Schumann magnetic field on planet Earth, and you relax and focus in the center of that coil, and you suddenly realize you're becoming a little bit clairvoyant. Okay, it depends. Now, in my case, I'm notoriously lousy at clairvoyance. It's probably laziness, but I have a fair amount of clairaudience for my whole life, hearing ancestors sometimes. I'm very audio dominant, you know. And I noticed that first you feel this little echo in the room, and then you realize your clairaudience, your ears ring a little bit because it's the onset of a coherent longitudinal field. And we talked about how Andrei Puharich just tripped over the physics of clairaudience when he was using piezoelectric triggering to enable deaf people to hear just before Enki Ea Atum made the first phone call that became how he taught Phyllis Schlemmer, which became the movie Star Wars. Actually, it was Enki Ea Atum through Andrei Puharich and then Phyllis Schlemmer, and that's how Star Wars was born. And you know why? It's because Andrea tripped over the physics of clairaudience. Anywho, so Laura calls me and she says, I had this incredible, intense bliss experience, and she noticed that her ability now, and she works regularly, I call it horse whispering. She's a very powerful animal healer. She's an amazing story. Like she had this pair of this horse that had their eyes literally burnt out in the fires, the famous fires in San Diego. And the horse, you know, they were going to have to put the horse down. And she had a meeting with the horse and had this whole clairaudient conversation with the horse and explained to the horse, well, you actually know inside you how to rebuild your eye. And all you have to do is, you know, focus, assemble, and rebuild. the short, and she's writing up this story for us. Her veterinary actually has the photographs proving this horse, whose eyes were missing, gone, burnt, regenerated its eyes, and those eyes in the medical evaluation were those of a foal, a young horse. This is called plasma regeneration 101. And so this is the kind of skill she had. She noticed that her ability to do this at a distance increased after the phi ray effect. And we know why. We know the physics of this action at a distance is when the vortex, the plasma in this case, gets centripetal, it embeds, implodes, phase coupled, it's called impedance matches into the nodes of the longitudinal array. And that is the stuff, that is literally the stuff of action at a distance, is coupling with this array. It's like, well, there was a little hologram inside my head. It's called Carl Prieber, the holographic brain. And suddenly you realize you can access a bigger hologram, which is the nodes of the bigger longitudinal array, if you coherently embed, implode into that array, whether you call it ancestor, memory, community of saints, the whole thing. Anyway, so Laurie's story will shortly be appearing at phiray.com. But talk about, you know, horse whisperer. And we had with Therify, it was famous that animals responded amazingly well, but they're actually hypersensitive to this. They actually need shorter sessions. And you start gently, but because they're extremely sensitive to telepathic. And you know, the secret of the horse whisperer actually is after you clearly visualize the picture, simple picture of what you want the horse to do, the secret is actually then you relax, you stomp your feet, you get grounded, and you release that picture. And it's when you release that picture that the horse picks it up. You actually send the spell. Anyway, so the spell, in effect, is the coherence of the longitudinal array into which you're embedding. Another very practical example is if you want to remember your dream when you're just waking up, do not move your head. This is simple, but it's physics. It's because the array actually is something you embed into, and your stillness, your ability to focus in that array is critical. So this is bringing us to the main subject of this course, how a charged vortex makes gravity, understanding electrogravitics and mind. And this lecture and the slideshow that goes with us is an emulation of a lecture that went viral entitled How a Charged Vortex Makes Gravity 4 months ago, went viral, 37,000 views. People are interested in this, and yet so few people actually can even conceive of what makes a vortex get centripetal and therefore make gravity and therefore make mindfulness. So I decided we're going to do a better job of that lecture, and I've prepared the slideshow and I'm ready to do my dance. And if I drink enough tea, my throat might even last. The key part of this story is to see the connection between the vortex, liquid crystal charge, plasma vortex that happens inside the synaptic array inside your head called the holographic brain. It's a vortex. These are synapses making a vortex. Absolutely, that's what consciousness is for sure. You need to know what consciousness is. It's a liquid crystal charge vortex that got implosive. That's what consciousness is. Don't let people tell you a mystery. We know exactly what consciousness is. And if you understand that, then and only then can you begin to understand what you take with you when you lucid dream and when you die, which is the implosiveness of that vortex generating a coherence field embedded into the longitudinal array, collective unconscious communion of saints, called, as we always say, the Ba from the Ka and the Kesjan body and the rainbow light body. These are names woo-woos, or Tibetans, use for the coherence of your aura embedding into that larger array. To step out of the local array inside your head into the bigger array, the longitudinal array called song lines and dreaming tracks, and the dodecaecosa earth grid. To get out of the little array into the bigger array, well, don't try it in aluminum buildings and electrosmog cities. Any Aboriginal can tell you, that ain't going to work. No, the Aboriginals know exactly where to go to step into that array, and it ain't aluminum buildings inside electrosmog cities. Hell no. They know that what we call a hospital actually is what they would call hell, because the songline dreaming tracks cannot get there. Okay, so that's the warm-up to this conversation. Now I'm going to launch the video or the visuals. The point is that what we're looking for, there are two critical mechanics which determine whether a vortex is going to implode and get gravity making. And those two critical components are, first of all, the vortex has to be piezo. It has to be charged. You can do it with water, but if you use it with rock powder in that water, as Schauberger knew, you can make more gravity. Now, if you do it with mercury, and you get the right red, which is a mercury doped, it's a doped iron powder making the mercury conductive to magnetics. So the vortex has to be saturated or charged. Second thing is the angle of that vortex has to optimize the translation from transverse EMF, which is not coherent compressional, out the squirt gun of Planck into the coherent longitudinal compression, which Tom Bearden very clearly wrote all the equations. Hello, you want to know what a gravity wave is? A gravity wave is made of? The equations are clear. A gravity wave is made of the compressional component of the electromagnetic. Now, if you happen to meet a physicist who thinks that gravity is made of something other than electromagnetic, we have a simple recommendation: hospitalization for schizophrenia. But other than that, if you want to know what a gravity wave is made of, it's the compressional component of the electron. And this is intuitively obvious because, look, the universe is like a big swing set, right? There's actually nothing solid in the universe. It's all these waves of the superfluid called charge. So how do you get a handle on that compression and push yourself around? Well, everybody's on the swing set and everybody's pushing the swing. Now, if you learn how to push the swing at the right time of the cycle, called the compressional node, you can push yourself around. That's how gravity making is made, by grabbing a hold of the compressional longitudinal component, which is not the up and down transverse component of the electromagnetic. If the transverse component of the electromagnetic hitting the center of the atom ain't going to implode and ain't going to make gravity. As the example was, the original nuclear device was called implosion for this reason. You took the longitudinal component, and the symmetric arrival of the critical longitudinal components in the first atomic bomb, dodecaecosa. Guess why? That's called critical mass. Now we know why, where the longitudinal nodes cross on the Earth grid, you can measure a difference in nuclear critical mass. Has anybody ever explained the physics of that before? So when we explain the physics of that vortex that's making gravity, you look for two things: whether the angle of the vortex optimizes the translation of vorticity from transverse electromagnetics into the compressional longitudinal, sometimes wrongly called scalar. The second thing is, if the angle of that vortex, visualize the pyramid angle or the 60-degree implosion angle, the angle of that vortex is correct, so that the phase velocities of the adding and multiplying of the wavelengths optimized by this kind of 60-degree charge collapse called platonic nesting. If the angle of the vortex optimizes into golden ratio heterodynes, then the adding and multiplying recursively constructively of the phase velocities only enabled by golden ratio. It's the only constructive recursive adding and multiplying. It's geometric arithmetic. That's
Then,
what
while you get a sip from your tea, Liz is asking, is gravity not polar to the light?
this is interesting. So is gravity not polar? If you were making a longitudinal wave squirting out both sides of your spacecraft, would you get propulsion? No. If you were making a longitudinal wave squirting more in one direction than the other direction, would you get propulsion? Yes. Is that polar? Another example of that is the difference between electronegative and electropositive. Turns out that electronegativity actually makes some propulsion. So we need to think about this carefully, but the short summary is that the longitudinal EMF projection propulsion squirt gun to make gravity needs to be directional. And that's going to have everything to do, for example, with how you steer your aura when you lucid dream and when you die, and how you steer the gravity maker in your electrogravitic. And that's more in the slides on that.
And Dan also asks, could you also say that what we call gravity is an electrical field?
Absolutely.
Electrical is the pull, and anti-gravity is the proton, is the push.
The gravity is the resultant charge acceleration from charge implosion to center. That's what gravity is. Is gravity electrical? But actually, that's kind of a simple question, because unless you're schizophrenic and don't believe in a unified field, otherwise everything is electromagnetic. So can we describe anything that's not electromagnetic? No. Everything's made of this unified substance of the compressible superfluid called charge. But in that sense, electrogravitics is the understanding of the implosion of the charge by which the squirt gun becomes directional, because it spits out longitudinal in one direction more than the other. So this is where we hopefully launch a little bit of slideshow here. So now here's my, let me see if I get this together.
And one last question from Liz. Gravity is dependent on light or interdependent?
Well, so, the photon is a slipknot of charge, just like the electron is a slipknot of charge. It's just, if you count the number of you count the quantum distance between electron shells, you express that quantum distance in photons. That's called quantized. And this subunit of that quantization is Planck. So obviously, everything's made of light. Yes, everything's made of charge. Everything's made of a slipknot donut of charge. It gets a little tricky after a while. You say, well, everything is made of the same stuff. How can you name that stuff? And every spiritual philosopher has grappled with that question. Well, if everything is made of the same stuff, do we have a name for that stuff? Well, you can call it charge, you can call it the ether, you can call it the unified field. We have so many names, but do we actually understand the nature of that substance? It is a superfluid of compressibility who achieves charge distribution only when fractality is perfected, which is the name of heaven. But for example, the charge distribution of a platonic nest, which is golden ratio charge collapse, is specifically this platonic nest right here, tetraoctacube inside, dodecicos outside, is the only symmetry of alchemy. It's the only symmetry of both electrons, SPDF suborbitals, it's all that, and the only symmetry of nuclear hadrons. They're both a simple platonic nest. And planetary orbitals, the same. The only definition of alchemy, the same. That implosive charge collapse. So once you understand how platonic nests make golden ratio, you understand the charge collapse that defines chemistry and defines gravity making and defines alchemy, that implosive force. Okay. So this compression into holographic fractality, the longitudinal array, that's the issue of our moment, to understand that embedding principle. And we talk about the Anu here. We're going to show that more in a moment. And so the clairvoyant described the Anu as 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. And this was all a mystery for centuries until we realized that those 7 spins, which happens to be the 7 layers of heart muscle and the origin of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the 7 spins of the tetracube, the 7 axes of spin tree of a tetrahedron, which is the tetracube inside, and the 5 spins is the pent symmetry of the dodecacosa. So when all the clairvoyants drew the Anu, what they were actually drawing was a plasma heart vortex of the result of Platonic charge collapse implosion. So the Anu is simply a name for the principle of what happens when you put a tetracube, 7 spins, inside dodecacosa, outside 5 spins. And so turn that inside out, that slip knot, that's the Anu, and clairvoyants saw that very, very clearly at the heart of the sun, the heart of the human heart, and the heart of hydrogen. They saw the same picture. And then they drew that chemistry and it was justified in atomic physics in psi-perceptional quarks by Phillips. And so that's called perfected invagination, the 7 stages of, which is the work of Steiner, 7 stages of invagination. And the 7 spins of the donut will actually dissociate into 7 separate donuts at the phase angle of the 7 spins of the tetra. Now you understand the physics of how the layers of the heart muscle were born, and you indeed cannot get a better squeeze, which is how you build the perfect tomato juicer, but also the only subject of the book, Jitterbug Perfume. It was a beet squeezing, which actually, that's the human heart muscle. It's a jitterbug. So in this conversation, we're also then going to include a little bit about how implosive charge collapse creates the chronovisor and a time device. And remember, we're not emphasizing this at this point, but we know for sure that you simply increase the field density of things like fire ray, and you do absolutely create time distortion events. And we understand why, because you simply, by achieving non-destructive compression, you achieve phase lock with increased spin density, spin rate. And the name for increased spin rate experience is called time. So experience where all many paths and errands meet, that implosive conversion. So there's many examples. For example, when Tesla used the carbon arc, remember the carbon arc was actually fullerene, and that's how Tesla started. And so the story of the chronovisor and the history, we're not going to do the ET history today, but these are very much related to this physics. And this is what the fullerene looks like. The fullerene is carbon, started Tesla's career, that makes the dodecacosa, and its phase conjugate to center, and therefore centripetal negentropic, like when fullerenes are used to create negentropic spaces in the center chemistry. Fullerenes were the hottest subject in modern chemistry for a long time because they're negentropic conjugators. And then that became the story of clathrates in water, also the same geometry, which became microhydrogen. So gaining energy during charge collapse is the reason objects fall to the ground. It's the reason consciousness perception forms in the brain synaptic array. It is the reason seeds germinate. We know now that you make this implosive longitudinal field, you dramatically affect seed germination and plant growth. Therify did that. Fire ray does that. It's the electrical reason soul and bliss exist. You implode into the longitudinal array. It is the electrical reason pyramids and obelisks make global wireless power. Imploding into the longitudinal array, and that distribution is the only definition of wireless power, and the longitudinal array is the only definition of action at a distance. What current physics calls entanglement is incorrect. It should be called phase conjugation, which is embedding perfected. It's the electrical reason golden ratio, Platonics, is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. That is a smoking gun that you stabilize gravity by charge collapse. It is the electrical reason electron shells and nuclear hadrons are Platonic nests. It's the electric reason all action at a distance, entanglement, etc. And this is just a practical example when we measure Jean-Charles Moyen's brainwave just before he achieved teleportation at a distance with witnesses, came back between sand between his toes. And here is the golden ratio, an octave cascade from alpha to gamma, implosive brain waves imploding into the array in that fiery density in the center of the piezo pineal. Remember, just before he teleported, he saw where he was going from in one eye and saw where he was going to in the other eye, reported it many times. So we know the absolute physics of teleportation, stargates, and you increase that compression. Sorry. I'm just getting over this.
I might say one thing on this subject matter. I had one experience where I actually bilocated. I was meditating at an ashram in India, and we were practicing using a tool, and this tool was a granite slab. It was about the size of my cell phone, but about 2 inches thick. So it was really heavy. I had to hold it up. So as I was staring into this, two things happened to me, and this is back in 2016. The first thing was this granite slab turned into a screen where I was watching two cigar spaceships battling above Earth. I think it was above Earth. And I was so amazed. I started tapping the side of the stone, thinking it was my cell phone. I was trying to turn the volume up, and that broke my meditation. And I was like just blown away. And then the next day, I was again practicing just staring into a granite slab, and suddenly I went from being inside of this massive tent with 1,200 people all meditating to being on Mars. My intuition told me it was Mars. I was on Mars at the corner edge of a black pyramid that had some red lighting around the openings. And as I stood there, and this, I was there for a good 10 to 15 seconds. As I was standing there, I was looking around. I turned around to look to see where I was, and all I saw was like red, dirt, red, dust. And I turned back and I see the pyramids just finished closing, and the dust begins to stick to it immediately. So my thinking was, oh, this is must be how they make themselves invisible to satellites, perhaps. This is just my thought that that's how it covers up. It immediately the
Well,
dust sticks to it.
the pyramid became electronegative and by electrostatic attraction for the, but also more importantly, and I love your story, is that granite slab, by not just being piezo, but there must have been super dielectrics in there. And that's the beginnings of a phase conjugate mirror, like the Olmec used the scrying through the obsidian for ancestor phone calls. So the black mirror of the phase conjugate mirror was ancestor. It's because that phase conjugate interface with the array, because of the super dielectric, is the beginning of a phase conjugate mirror, which is the physics of ancestor phone calls. It's literally a window into the longitudinal array, which is, for example, how the coding worked on Nostradamus's scrying cup. So understanding how super dielectrics make a phase conjugate mirror is the intro to exactly that phenomena, where that became a window. It's a beautiful story. I love it.
Yeah, it was amazing. And the fact that I was teleported to I wish I would check my feet to see if I had any red dust that I brought back with me.
Yeah.
But I definitely bilocated because I went from being in this room to being on Mars. And my intuition tells me it was Mars. And then I was back in the room, and I was like, just it was no different than me being in this room that I am now. And then suddenly everything was another planet.
And
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 it was quite amazing. I've
and
been
Harry,
meaning to
uh,
find that stone.
you had total recall.
Oh yeah.
And the title of the movie about Mars. But also the point that's beautiful about that story is we can look at the physics now. The array, you had a room full of meditators. You had a lot of longitudinal coherence there. And I'm sure that granite had not just piezo, but super dielectrics. And so that's what made it a phase
And
conjugate.
the last thing I want to say about that is later I learned from some other disclosures that there were some cylindrical ships, cigar ships,
Yeah.
that are made of stone, and they have a control panel that's just a big slab that I imagine you need to have your third eye activated
Yeah.
to actually see the control system on it.
Which is the physics of clairvoyance, which onsets with when you're in a longitudinal coherence field, basically, which is why the physics of clairvoyance is so essential to all this. It's embedding coherently and to propagate into that longitudinal array by embedding. And so it's beautiful, Harry. Really, Harry, you're a very valuable guest, Harry. We love you. Thank you. So now, so the focus of this conversation is to understand how this Schauberger vortex, and this is related to what Harry was referring to earlier in the original drawings from the Jonathan and Dolly Implosion Research, Plymouth in UK. This is a 50,000 RPM non-fractionating flat impeller, hopefully coated with gold or silver, and the inside of the egg shape is coated with gold or silver in one case, which Harry is speaking of. So now you're able to concentrate the implosive capacitance. And if you put a wire at the bottom center versus the max diameter point, there is a voltage difference. And that voltage difference is the pressure change because charge is released through center at the bottom, propagating a longitudinal coherent wave directionally at that point. And that voltage difference is both a vacuum coherence zero-point energy generator and it is a gravity maker. So the reason this vortex is making vacuum energy and gravity is the subject of our entire talk. We are now going to discuss why the angle of this vortex, if it's correct, and if it's piezo enough, will do two things. It will convert the transverse electromagnetic to directional longitudinal at the center of the narrow point. And it will do a second thing. It will add and multiply the phase velocities recursively constructively by golden ratio and implode the charge out through the center. Ideally, the harmonic content of the triggering will also be Planckfire.com. So two things are happening. We're creating longitudinal directionally by transverse to electromagnetic conversion down the throat of that vortex, and we're adding and multiplying the golden ratio with that vortex angle is correct, and that heterodyning, recursive, implosive, constructive can go through Planck tuning through the speed of light only when it's tuned to Planck implosive at that point, Planckfire.com, as evidenced by Professor Raymond Chow's famous measurements of faster than speed of light velocities, centering around golden ratio times c, the speed of light, 1.618 times c, which is the smoking gun that I am correct. This is the reason gravity exists. So we want to look at this in a little more detail. So for one thing, this is the core subject. Remember, we're not just talking about how electrogravitics work. We're talking about how DNA makes gravity. We're talking about how the vortex inside your head makes gravity. We're talking about how mercury vortex makes gravity. We're talking about how a water vortex makes gravity. We're talking about how a vortex in a piezoelectric crystal, Koski-Frost, makes gravity. All of the above require understanding exactly this. Two things need to happen. Optimize the adding multiplying of phase velocities by golden ratio right here. So the implosion at center where the squirt gun nozzle exists, called Planck, squirts out coherent longitudinal directionally. And second of all, here, that converts, if the angle is correct, the transverse going in one end translates, it's called optimized translation of vorticity. The definition of golden spiral in hydrodynamics means the translation of vorticity converts the transverse going in here and the wide side of the vortex out the narrow squirt gun of that vortex. It's converted efficiently, non-destructively into directional longitudinal, sometimes called scalar, which is compressional, on the right here. And that's how the squirt gun made the longitudinal, otherwise named a gravity wave. So that is the principle we want to work with here to understand how gravity is made in a vortex. And if we knew that, then we could know how mind is made. Remember, Bill Tiller's measuring 10 different ways focused human attention causes electric fields to implode, compress. He didn't have a clue why, but he knew. If you want to be powerful, your mind is a gravity maker. It's an imploder. Now, also, if you've ever had a mind meld with an Orion Queen Mog Draco, the reason the aura of a Draco would kill most humans for one simple reason: it is so implosive. Unless you get implosive, you can't throw your weight around. It's centripetal. This is called the vice-like grip of the mind meld with the Orion Queen Mog. It's classic. And we're not doing ET stories here, so we're going to skip that part. But the point is, the power of that mind is centripetal. And you can measure how centripetal you are, and you know how much mind you got. That's electrical engineering. That's not woo-woo philosophy. No, that's the physics of measuring how electrically centripetal your mind is. Bill Tiller's famous book, Conscious Acts of Creation. So you want to get powerful. Hello. That's why In our next ET lecture featuring Jake at Astral Urma on the YouTube channel, he will be describing how he used flameandmind.com to train his brain to get more centripetal, the golden ratio, alpha to beta implosive, alpha to gamma harmonics in his brain, get more centripetal. And he was more powerful in the astral battles. Hello? It's called Get Centripetal or Get Dead. So this slide is in French. Oops. but the transverse wave went up and down, whereas the longitudinal compressional wave, and when the longitudinal compressional wave components, whoever prepared this slideshow used the French one instead of the English one. Sorry, a few minor details here. But the point is that you cannot get centripetal at the center if you're being struck by the transverse wave. No, that's just going to make you nervous. But if you want to implode at center, you have to arrange symmetrically, opposing direction of the longitudinal components. It's how critical mass defined the first nuclear device. It's how four-wave mixing defines phase conjugate optics. It's how the sacred four directions. It's the reason why action at a distance is easier at sunrise and sunset. So this is, you've seen all the golden ratio stuff.
Dan,
Yes.
while we are at that slide, Dan Mac asks, are you able to describe how the vertical of transverse waveform turns into the horizontal longitudinal waveform?
Well, yes. So I think this picture might be helpful. So here, the transverse wave, you can think of it as vertical. It's a right angle to. So the up and down motion of the transverse wave here, the motion up and down of that wave is perpendicular to the direction of propagation. Whereas on the right, the compressional, longitudinal, or scalar wave, the oscillation, the vibration is parallel to the direction of propagation. And that phase shift from vertical up and down to parallel to direction, that is called the L. It doesn't mean going to hell. No. It means the L as in Elohim. the L is a name for the Lord, well, which is, by the way, the shape of Alpha Draconis in old astrology. But the L is actually a name for the one who is able to make that L or phase shift in their aura and propagate the transverse to longitudinal. And that is being the Lord, the L as in Elohim. The Lord is the one who gets that translation of vorticity working and propagates in the L, and that is the beginning. Ba from the Ka, Kesjan body, rainbow light body. It is the beginning of physicsofsoul.com. You want to have a soul? You need to learn to implode that. So let's see, where were we in the slide show? So it is a right angle. So the idea is that conventional physics says action at a distance starts with entanglement. They have the wrong language. Entanglement is an introduction to the physics of embedding perfected, which is the problem phase conjugation solves. So in fact, what they call entanglement hooking up Einstein-Rosen bridge is actually a bad name for what phase conjugation does by connecting the longitudinal array. A more accurate language. Thank you, conventional physics. Let's use the more accurate language to describe the physics of all action at a distance. For example, if you make microwave interferometry, you can create and store heat at a distance. Hint to all the dummies trying to create fusion and contain heat at a distance without using microwave coherent longitudinal interferometry. They're dummies. And so there's lots of slides about this. This is our published paper on the equation for how hydrogen works, built exactly on just the physics we just described. So we promised, oops, we have someone in the waiting room here. Wait. Pete, as he says, waiting. Admit, okay. Welcome, Pete. You're in. So we promised that this lecture would talk about examples of electrogravitics, how devices make gravity. This is a very famous, it's called the EM drive. You see a trapezoidal shaped cone here. I think it's brass, it's metal. And there's a microwave cascade inside that trapezoidal cone. Now, if the dummies who built this knew how to tune that microwave to PlanckFire.com, they could make a whole lot more gravity. But what's happening is the microwave cascade phase conjugates and squirts longitudinal directionally. No one else on planet Earth has ever described to you how the famous EM drive makes gravity. I just did. That came from me. That's an example of gravity making implosion. We're going to also use some of the Podklednov work. So this is, you've all seen the PlanckFire.com equations, how you take Planck and golden ratio and you create the implosion, and that predicts 200 clear physical variables predicted by Planck times integer exponents of golden ratio, fractal phase conjugate charge implosion perfected. And that is the origin of negentropy and, in fact, how all centripetal and negentropic forces are born, PlanckFire.com. And those are slides you've already seen. So here I tried to pick on our friends who I call woo-woos, who are trying to teach how gravity works, who actually do not have a clue why objects fall to the ground. So I think anybody who doesn't know why objects fall to the ground should not pretend to teach how gravity making works, because they don't know. You must know why objects fall to the ground. And objects fall to the ground because of that implosion of capacitance right there, that implosive squirt gun. And this we called symptoms of Einstein-induced insanity, not knowing why objects fall to the ground, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this, yeah, there's more slides about that. And then I talk about Stephen Hawking's. And we Scorpios are not famous for being humble. But actually, in this, a prime example here is Tesla's mistake. So Tesla didn't understand how phase conjugation, because all of Tesla's devices, like his ray gun and starting with carbon carbon arc, were phase conjugate. But he tried to make these plasma beam weapons. But Tesla got the frequencies wrong, and he got the nodal locations wrong for the longitudinal array. So he could never get global wireless power to work because he didn't understand how to optimize phase conjugation, because no one told him about PlanckFire.com, actually. And here, you see how those exact phase conjugate frequencies. Here's the Schumann harmonics. Here's the brainwave harmonics. Here's the Therapy harmonics. Here's the phi ray harmonics. Here's the harmonics of the breath and the brainwave and the Schumann, all exactly fitting the equation in PlanckFire.com. And this is, again, Tom Bearden's book, showing very detailed equations that if you understand the mechanics of coherent longitudinal propagation, not only do you get the only wave mechanics of gravity making, but you also get the negentropy possibility in plasma, and spent much of his life studying Anton Priori, which was the antecedent of Therapy, which is now called PhiRay.com. So basically, the plasma mechanics, as you all know how this works, is when a donut turns inside out recursively, implosively, consciousness is born. Even ball lightning responding to telepathy is a nice example, because the phase conjugate implosion at center couples with the longitudinal array, and that's why ball lightning does so well responding to telepathy. So we had many lectures about this, and this is just showing that platonic implosion nest is literally the only reason electron shells exist. SPDF subshells, S is toroidal, pi is tetracubic, and then DF is dodecaecosa. Obviously, the star mother kit is the only definition of platonic nests. And by the way, it's the only definition of the nuclear hadron's symmetry in the arrangement of the nuclear protons and neutrons in the nucleus, tetra, cube, octa, ecosa. And so obviously the reason the atomic table exists is the implosive charge collapse of platonic nesting. That's the reason the atomic table exists. And the fact that your chemistry teacher failed to tell you that is a shocking sin, because the kids are never going to understand why the atomic table exists until somebody tells them that platonic implosion is the reason the atomic table is held together. Look, if you know that charge goes in a circle, and you call that rotation of charge mass, that inertia, if you don't know what holds that charge rotating in a circle, which is the gravity that holds it centripetally. So if you don't know the origin of any centripetal force, you should not be teaching chemistry, because you don't know what chem means, access to that black hole. And so Kepler was so right in saying that planetary orbitals are platonic nests, but he didn't know why he was right, because that's how gravity is made and stabilized, and why the golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. Spirosolaris.ca, smoking gun that I am right. Golden ratio is the way gravity is made and stabilized. Next section, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Mercury vortex making gravity. And it's a very romantic notion. It's the heart of the matter. It sounds Sufi. We're not going to go into Ken Wheeler stuff. And so this is the book, Conscious Acts of Creation, Bill Tiller. A lot of this is review, but this is where he first showed 11 different ways to measure the physics that focused human attention is electrically centripetal. He wasn't even brave enough to ask the question of why, but at least he proved focused human attention is electrically implosive. We are here to answer the question of why, because then we can make human attention. We could learn, for example, why when you remove the poisonous fluorescent lights from your kid's classroom and install sunlight, you make attention span, because attention span is the stuff that's made when charge implodes. So if you get the frequency recipe right, hint, solar hydrogen, you can make attention in your kid's classroom. Yank out that sinful fluorescent wrong power spectra and install attention into your kid's classroom. Hello, after you learn what attention is made of. So this is more on the physics of attention. The fusion point in the pinhole mirror is where it turns inside out in phase conjugate. And that is the fusion point of the vortex cone. And that is actually the introduction of the physics of the phase conjugate mirror and the fact that the origin of perception itself is phase conjugation. And later we talk about stargates in that. So the turning inside out point of the pinhole mirror is a beautiful introduction to the physics of the phase conjugate physics of perception. And it's why John Dee was studying the scintillation sparkle, literally scintillation, as he studied the sparks of scintillation in order to use that to communicate with ancestors. For the same reason he was studying the Aztec phase conjugate mirror, which became the showstone, in order to have ancestor phone calls. So John Dee was using a black mirror. The Olmecs were using a black mirror, and they were making ancestor phone calls. So John Dee was very intuitively on the right track. And even the reason the Globe Theater, Shakespearean theater, is cube octa for a very specific reason. You experience a sequence of collective emotion embedded into an implosive symmetry array based on four-wave mixing, the phase conjugate mirror, the cube octa. And the only subject of all of Shakespeare, if you understand deeply, is the physics of alchemy, which is why when you walk out of that theater, e pluribus unum, you felt a oneness experience. You got the oneness experience because the symmetry of the sequence of emotions of the collective you saw became fused in your mind because of that cube octa. So that was an intro to phase conjugate physics of perception and oneness possibility. That is the reason all of Shakespeare is, the subject is alchemy, alchem, access to that black hole. This is from, we get a credit, Tony Rodriguez here has been studying. I introduced him to the idea that the longitudinal array was the physics of all remote viewing for his remote viewing school. And he became interested in how the obelisk was a node for longitudinal array and therefore remote viewing, which is very useful. And then he realized, and he saw this in the physics, that the distance between the obelisk and the water in each case was noble and fixed by equation. Why? Why did the alchemy of the Eiffel Tower, made of alchemic iron, not steel, purify the water? The Egyptians, they were purifying their water by amplifying the centripetal force of the longitudinal array, and that's what the obelisks were for. That was actually a fertility device. And now Tony is selling obelisks, which I think are far more powerful at firecrystal.com, but it's a very beautiful introduction to physics. And so when someone is having bliss, here's the plasma of the twinkle in their eye. Oh, it's dodecaicosa. This is at a rave concert. But the actual plasma of the orb is dodecaicosa. We looked at this slide already. We're not going to do all this. So this relates to the origin of the alphabet and the hypercube of Ophanum and Nochian. And the implosive here is 5 spins inside and 7 spins outside, 6 around 1. And here's
Would you like to go over
angle.
a few questions then?
You've seen these slides before. And this, the star mother actually became E8, which predicts all the subatomic zoo, actually, which is all based on golden ratio. And this is the toroid of the origin of DNA and the Lord of the Ring and the physics of Hebrew letters. We have a little bit too much. But this is when DNA implodes and becomes centripetal. It's in the microscope toroidal, and the DNA is specifically responding to the phonon of coherent human bliss. And that implosion up that helix is obeying our physics. This will be an introduction to the helix in the vortex of the Koski-Frost gravity-making quartz crystal, as it is in the DNA here, in the famous drawing of Ann Ting, who was my friend, who started with Coxeter in this work. So the vertical increment of turn with golden ratio, the radius of turn with golden ratio squared, and the radius, golden ratio squared, and golden ratio cubed. So the increments of turn were all based on golden ratio, and that implosion is how DNA makes a soul, and that became the 4 stages in the lattice cobweb tunnel spiral. What you will see when you die, the reason you see lattice cobweb tunnel spiral when you die, the Heinrich-Kluver form constants, is right here. Your DNA had to implode like that, or you ain't getting through death. And this is the university literature. You've all seen that the measured harmonics in university studies of what frequencies trigger lucid dreaming reasonably close to PlanckFire.com. Now we know why Therapy and now phi ray is such a dramatic lucid dreaming trigger. Because you implode and propagate into the longitudinal array, and that's the physics of lucid dreaming and clairvoyance and how you take memory through death. And this, the Toltec referred to this death defier as an encounter with the dreaming membrane. What is a dreaming membrane? Does that sound like a phase conjugate mirror to you? When Nostradamus learned to paint the right superdielectric black coating on the bottom of his water scrying cup, do you think that was a dreaming membrane? So the phase conjugate point between the horizon at sunset, you use that accurate point, and then you set up Agnihotra, living plasma, and that radiates, like why the Bhopal and the Nagasaki survivors were the ones who did Agnihotra, radiating radical longitudinal coherence. So that longitudinal coherence is the physics of Agnihotra. It's implosive phase conjugate living plasma. And so here is the galaxy's biggest stargate, the trapezium in Orion, literally a cube. And this is how the Orion Wars started. Hello. And this is the light cone. Notice Pleiades, Sirius, and Orion are in that 60-degree light cone. This is a gravity lens. This is introduction of why Sirius B, if you read Walter Cruttenden, LostStar.com, Sirius B is the Dogon well knew, is that which around our sun rotates. Hello, after you learn that precession is 24,000 years, not 26,000. LostStar.com, Walter Cruttenden fits PlanckFire.com equation beautifully. So the center around which the widening gyre is a center that cannot hold. So when you make this figure eight motion, as in the Infinity Walk, Deborah Sundbeck, you actually dramatic solution to dyslexia for sure. And you're simply making a figure eight, imploding the plasma. Too many slides here. So consciousness is the collapse of the wave function. Most scientists agree that gravity and consciousness are caused or the result of the collapse of the wave function. What they don't have a clue is how you collapse the wave function, because they have not read PlanckFire.com. But this was agreed by all the high levels. Consciousness causes wave function. Well, how do you collapse wave function? How do you make the implosive collapse of the wave function? It is called PlanckFire.com. And this was the centerpiece of all the Templar work, which actually was Thoth directly. They call this the Rochelle grid. And they did the repair of the fabric of time with the Templars by this specific geometry, actually. All this work on the Templars and the repair of the fabric of time is at goldenmean.info/Buehler, Buehler. And indeed, this is the Templar history of the repair of the fabric of time. And time won't fractionate if you do this right. I'm not going to do the drone story. So this is an example of a vortex making gravity. And the angle of that vortex has to spit out the longitudinal component at the apex of that vortex and this will become net centripetal, and that charge collapse is the origin of that negentropy. Here they're talking about the reactor of the future, but they actually don't got this right. They think you got to convert hydrogen to helium. It's simpler than that, kids. So this introduces the physics of firecrystal.com, that the helix of that crystal, and the pictures coming up from that Koski frost, the helix of that quartz crystal, if it's tuned to Planck, the helix of the SiO2 quartz, the z-axis, actually is imploding in the cascade. And the harmonics of that cascade all fit PlanckFire.com. And that's how they made 800 times its own weight in gravity at Koski frost, the famous gravity-making quartz crystal, which is the fire crystal of Atlantis. That is the physics. Now, in the Nazi Vimana, the mercury vortex was doped with a conductive red iron powder, making it red, although Penny Bradley believes there was another chemistry that's very interesting. But the point is that then they actually also, in addition to doping it for conductivity, the mercury vortex, and rotating it between cylinders, then they would use a low level of gamma radioactivity, which, as you know, the Paul Brown nuclear battery made it quasi-superconductive, but also very dangerous. And also, Penny Bradley's right. I think the Nazis had a problem. The mercury vortex kept turning to gold on them. They had a big problem. It's hilarious, actually. So the angle of that vortex, and Charlie Zeiss did a good job on this. So the reason the tip of the Egyptian pyramid versus the tip of the Russian pyramid, the base in one case and the tip in the other case is 76 degrees, it's simply to make golden ratio in that vortex. And that's how the Vimana worked, and how the vortex worked, and how the repulsing worked at piezoelectric doped water. These are examples of vortex making gravity. And we did this work, and we actually made some gravity with water vortex. Fractalfield.com/propulsion. And at fractalfield.com/propulsion, you know, you can download the book. I'm sure many of you have Bill Donovan's book, Glimpses of Epiphany, on the history of the physics of Koski frost, the famous crystal that made gravity, the PlanckFire book. And so the reason Atlantis concentric rings were implosive capacitance, hello, Thoth, actually the Apkallu, were designing a implosive capacitor named Atlatl, which in ancient language means to project. Hello. So you've all seen these slides. And this is how you can use a pine cone even for rainmaking. And the tree would adjust the angle of the seeds on that pine cone for implosive capacitance to adjust the amount of power it needed to get from gravity in the pine cone as the seasons change, as Lawrence Gardner predicted in his book, Vortex of Life Fields of Form, Lawrence Edwards. So this is Grebennikov floating on a super dielectric. These insect skeletons evolved to be a super dielectric. And the geometry of the, look at the little heart-shaped cavities here. It's called the cavity structure effect. So not only do you need a super dielectric to make gravity, these floating on these insect skeletons, but the geometry of the cavity in that implosive superdielectric capacitance were Valentine heart-shaped, called cavity structure effect. Physicists' analysis of why insect skeletons made gravity. Elena Danaan wanted to know how you make floating cities. Hello. So this is an introduction to Koski frost and gravity making through a wormhole. And then I was showing Elena Danaan how the clicker at the center, there's a quartz implosive fire crystal at the center of the double Dorji, and there's a clicker, and that clicker would make a strong piezoelectric phonon pulse wave, which would propagate through that crystal like firecrystal.com, and that would squirt longitudinal out the center of the spark gum of the double Dorji, and this was Neptune's trident. Okay, and this is so teaching the physics of the trident. You need to know how you make a piezoelectric quartz implode and spit out longitudinal. That's the physics of the Vajra and the trident. I made 9 films with Elena Danaan on this, and this is all at firecrystal.com. And these again are the frequencies from piezofire.com, ideal for driving firecrystal.com, which also is beautifully ignited by firay.com, as it also can be ignited by the Mayer wave in your breath. And this is the phase conjugate pump wave of the Schumann cascade, which is the reason pyramids make wireless power. Here's the Schumann cascade. perfect phase conjugate pump wave, imploding in the piezo crystal of the properly tuned pyramid, spitting out coherent longitudinal directionally at the base, named a gravity diode, the definition of pyramid wireless power, spitting out that coherent longitudinal into the array. And this was the physics of global wireless power. And unfortunately, Tesla didn't figure out that you had to be at the longitudinal nodes to pick it up, and you needed Planckfire.com to make it accurately. So Tesla didn't finish the job. Not picking on the poor guy, but until you know what Planckfire.com is, you can't properly make a longitudinal array. And this is the equation, Planckfire, predicting the spine liquid pump harmonics called human bliss and kundalini. And this is the same harmonics, Schumann, in the brainwaves. And this is more about pyramid wireless power. Here are some of the pictures of the actual quartz crystal making gravity. So you got the z-axis. It's a helical axis. It's a slinky. And now you motorize that. You input on the perpendicular axis a pressure wave called phonon stricture. And that motorizes the long wave coupled to the short wave, because the slinky's length changes in a long wave to a short wave coupled to the distance change in diameter of that slinky, the short wave. The short wave coupled to the long wave is called phonon, long wave, stricture, coupled to electric, short wave. And that connection between the long wave and the short wave defines not just piezoelectricity, but then if that coupling between the long wave and the short wave, defining piezoelectric in DNA and quartz, if that harmonic cascade becomes Planckfire.com implosive, now you got a gravity maker. And that was called Koski-Frost, making 800 times its own weight in gravity. And the government went to a lot of trouble to remove this book from every university in the country. Bill Donovan showed. And indeed, they were using a phase conjugate pump wave, and this would change size dramatically before it made 800 times its own weight in gravity. And this is the book from Bill Donovan on Koski-Frost called Glimpses of Epiphany. The whole history of that story, the full PDF, thanks to Bill Donovan, now Elizabeth, at fractalfield.com/propulsion. And here's measuring those harmonics in the pyramid with Sam. He's got 1 million people a year coming, getting rejuvenation. And here's the harmonics, Planckfire.com, predicting what frequencies are making that pyramid create rejuvenation. He even measured the 27,000, he measured 28 kilohertz on the roof. We now know why those pyramids were making wireless power. Now, not only was the Schumann cascade present, but the cascade all the way up to 28 kilohertz, measurably present. This is how the pyramids made a gravity diode. This is the physics we want to introduce here. And if you can't make gravity diodes, if you read the book 2/3, hello, your planet's going to lose its atmosphere. That's called planet taming. Read the book 2/3, David Meyer, David Percy. Planet taming consists of that skill. And that was Thoth, basically. That's what the Apkalu was about. So this is where we talk about the stupidity of not understanding tuning a planet to the negentropy of implosion. I mean, here you got Lovelock, writes the whole book, Gaia Hypothesis, about how we got negentropic, not having a clue of how Gaia is negentropic. Hint, Schumann's a phase conjugate bump wave. So if you tune your whole city structure, and Elena even has beautiful drawings on many other planets of how they make these big fractal Schumann antenna to gather enough power to power their cities. Until you understand phase conjugate pump waves making gravity, you can't even power your cities. So it's a long way from downtown here. We know that. We're not going to go into this story, but basically I'm explaining to Dan Willis that actually you can't accurately phase conjugate in the Vogel crystal because the sides are not parallel. And we explain all this at firecrystal.com. And the beauty of simple tools like piezofire.com, the perfect way to make these cascades. And if you make these cascades, you raise the Jed, literally the Jedi. And so now, seeing as how my voice is fading out, I'm going to stop the screen.
Dan, would you like to go over a few questions?
Perfect timing, perfect timing. I have a little tea and fire with the questions.
Sure. Roland asks, why does the caduceus EMF drive work with an angle phase conjugation if a Vogel crystal does not work with an angle and should be parallel?
You know, I knew Marcel Vogel for more years than Dan Willis, I think, but whatever. Sweet guy, but he had some hygiene problems, not to pick on. But the point was that since Vogel didn't understand the actual physics of phase conjugating accurately, he approximated that in two different ways. He used his own breath. I saw him sweating. He ate a 10-course Chinese dinner right after I was there. When he was using his quartz crystal to entrain a plant leaf on Cleve Baxter's polygraph, he was able to take his crystal and the plant leaf would respond, and they measured that on polygraph. Vogel was very psychokinetic, it's true. But to accurately phase conjugate, there's a way to approximate that with your breath, for example. A 10-second Mayer wave breath is a wonderful way for a phase conjugate pump wave to entrain a crystal. But you can approximate that with tapered side on a crystal. But if you want to do it accurately, the tapered sides, because if you actually measured the power spectra of that crystal, our fire crystal, we're much, much closer to pure phase conjugate plankfire.com. Whereas the tapered sides of the crystal will approximate phase conjugation, but never, ever, ever can they sustain that accurately, because whatever angle you use, the natural quartz crystal were flat-sided, actually, and the original Atlantean fire crystal, if you were there, and Louis Acker was, it's a long story, he had too much LSD, I shouldn't mention Louis Acker, but he wrote the book on the fire crystal of Atlantis, and we had meetings with the quartz crystal industry of Western New York on this side. We worked with the Edgar Casey literature on the Toy Stone for years. But the short summary is that the tapered side of the Vogel crystal, it's useful, but it's not accurately conjugate, so it'll never be as powerful as firecrystal.com, PHIRE, which is more accurately tuned to phase. Now, if you did it even more accurately, you would have a vacuum energy device for sure. But did I address the question there, Tufan? How did I do?
Yes, so the question was, why does the Caduceus EMF drive work with an angle phase conjugation if a Vogel crystal does
Yes.
not work with an angle?
Thank you for helping me get focused on that question. So in the trapezoidal shape of the EM drive, if that trapezoid, if they had known plankfire.com, they could have got the angle of that trapezoid accurate, and they could have phase conjugated accurately, but they don't understand why objects fall to the ground, so they're kind of dumb. But if they got the angle of that vortex trapezoid in the EM drive correct, and then they had used plankfire.com to take the power spectrum and accurately phase conjugate that microwave, they could make one heck of a lot more gravity if they weren't so dumb. They need to read my book. Hello. But in that case, actually, that would imply there could be some ideal angle to possibly do that in quartz, but I think it wouldn't be very feasible for a whole bunch of very subtle electrical reasons. So the efficient way to do that is you have a far fewer number of harmonics to accurately tune if your crystal has parallel sides. And remember, ultimately, every single harmonic nodal vibration in that crystal has to fit plankfire.com, or you ain't going to be making gravity or energy very efficiently. So if you've got spurious harmonic modes, anyway, bit of a complicated physics. Go ahead, next question.
Is the fire crystal a right or left-hand crystal?
Ooh, that is a tricky question. That's like asking a biologist, why does the helix in every single living protein go one way only as an up the down staircase? Well, I can tell you that there ain't no biologist on this planet that seems to have an answer to that question, as far as I know. But you're asking me to answer the question anyway, huh? I think it has something to do with the following. We know that lightning stirred the protein chains in the first primal soup to make DNA. You put lightning into primal soup, the bromine gas, the whole thing, and you make the first precursors of DNA, living proteins. Lightning did it. Lightning was the stir. Now, supposing you're trying to make a helix hang together and implode called life out of proteins. Now, if the direction in which you were stirring, the helicity of the polarity of the DC lightning in the primal soup, if the direct current of the lightning in the primal soup that was stirring those proteins to make that first helix called life in the primal soup, if the polar direction of that lightning was centrifugal and not centripetal, you would have got crap. The whole thing would have blown apart. No, you need the DC polarity, which will be centripetal, if you want to turn that helix into life in Implode. Well, now let's study which DC polarity is more centripetal than the other. Have you ever studied the literature on magnetism? You take the positive pole of a magnet, stick it on your toothache, the pain gets worse, but the healing increases. It's centripetal. You take the negative pole of that same magnet, stick it on your toothache, the pain gets less, but the healing rate is less also because it's not centripetal. So is the difference between electronegative and electropositive the difference between centripetal and centrifugal? So now you got to have the argument which DC polarity is centripetal and which one is centrifugal. Now, if you understand that electronegativity in general is implosive, I'm just hinting here this is a wonderfully useful meditation, and physics is profoundly confused. I would like to say also that now that you've said the plus and minus pole of a magnet, then you get the next problem. The Chinese make all the magnets on planet Earth pretty much, and they label the plus and minus pole the opposite of the way we label them in the West. So is there any agreement? This is confusing. And if you're trying to study which magnets to implode magnetism to treat water, the history of theimploder.com, you see how fun this conversation was. So did I manage to confuse the question? Absolutely. Go ahead, Tufan.
Could you possibly describe the shape needed to intensify Denmark's fire field?
Shape needed to intensify the phi ray field. Remember, we said the negentropic centripetal plasma field healing of Theraphi and now phi ray more powerful is exactly like the physics of the well-known documented measured healing effect of negative ion wind. On the side of the hospital with the negative ion wind by the ocean, you can measure dramatic increase in healing rate. This is proven, it's been measured, this is studied. Strong negative ion wind therapy can remove spinal meningitis, amazing ability to kill viruses. All kinds of problems are solved by strong negative ion wind therapy. And plasma implosion therapy is just massive negative ion wind therapy. It's the same thing, but on a bigger scale. That's what plasma implosion, they call it cold plasma. And it's famous in medical literature. Cold plasma is well known for all kinds of healing. This is not new information. Now, the people that did the study on negative ion wind therapy, our friend Joyce in Scotland there, she proved she had the negative ion wind therapy devices and it was healing all kinds of stuff. If you had the room full of living biologic material like cotton sheets and everything's natural and wood, hey, she got all these wonderful effects. And then she had another room which was full of synthetics and metal, and the negative ion wind never worked, ever. You fill a room with synthetics and metal and negative ion therapy is crap. Hello, what's the difference? The difference is called dielectric constant, which is the ability of an electric field to efficiently breathe and implode charge. It's called the dielectric constant, which is charge distribution efficiency, which is also the only definition of heaven, actually, or plains of Charon or Champs-Élysées. It's super. It's a charge distribution was perfected. It's heaven because you can live forever there. Well, negative ion wind and living plasma. So if you want to make your living plasma, that's why in Northern California, where we had that Therapy Center way out in nature, they got to be famous. You know, you got living air and you got living material all over it. It's like if you're in a forest or a rainforest or someplace where you got all biology, or it's why Luke Skywalker had to go deep underground into living nature. That's where he raised his Jed, the Jedi. So to concentrate the living field of things like phi ray and Therapy, you need a high dielectric environment, an environment where charge implosion is permissive. You get natural fields, you got your sacred altar, you got the history of your ancestors' prayers, you got A magnetic ley line cross. You got sacred. Well, if you got a stone temple handy, that would also be useful. You got sunset, sunrise handy. Any place where the magnetic lines converge and implode, you could increase the temple effect.
Another one from Liz. What is happening with a synchronized high amplitude waking delta alpha dominant pattern?
Delta is a longer wave coherence in the brain wave. I can say that after 30 years of intense Kundalini, I developed very high amplitude, low frequency delta, actually. Uh, and not so much in the high gamma 44. No, not so much. But low frequency delta, oh yeah, big time, huge peaks. Delta, alpha, I can do 5 harmonics beautifully. And I can tell you what that delta did for me. It's very directly related to the clairaudience for ancestor phone calls. When I'm good and disciplined, I can hear kind of which ancestor's making phone calls to Valerie. She knows which ear's ringing, and she oh, you know, there's an ancestor calling. Who's calling? You know, I can hear ancestors calling. I'm not a highly disciplined clairaudient, but I know what the physics is, and on my good days, I can hear the ancestors. And the reason I am clairaudient, in part, is that very high amplitude, low frequency delta, which is in conventional EEG study literature, that is called access to the deep unconscious. It's literally embedding into that array. So I can do the longer waves pretty well in my EEG, which means I get access to the longer wave of racial memory. And when you say that's on waking, that would kind of fit the physics here. Whereas then beta, and then finally all the way up to gamma, when you get that gamma coherence, which I don't got, then you get the more of the lucid dreaming and the specifically the clairvoyance, which the kids who were learning to see with their eyes, when they climb to gamma, that's the moment when their vision without eyes, related to clairvoyance, also was when they began to see their grandmothers, their ancestors. They began to see their dead grandmothers for that reason when they climbed to gamma. So that's a brief, crude introduction to brainwave science.
Next one from Keith. He says, "Hey Dan, I am working on using your work to create a sacred space within my city using electroculture. If I am using high dielectric materials, 52 angle slope angle of golden ratio times Planck tuned spirals of copper wire going along wooden spikes that I'm driving into the ground in a fractal array. Is this the right track or am I missing something? Caduceus winding perhaps, or any guidance on this?"
No, electroculture is famous and well studied and very useful. Our friend here in France, he's quite famous. You know, if he could tell in advance how long his carrots were going to be by how deep he planted the copper wire. So obviously, increasing the density of that. And that's why a longitudinal field will radically increase seed germination and plant growth. And you can stabilize that. The thing is, plant growth ultimately is going to require phase lock with the sun. So it is good to have some tunability to these things. So not only do you want the resonance with the Schumann cascade and tuning to Planck fire, which is amplified Schumann essentially, but then you want to be aware of the geometry of the nodes of the array. For the same reason they use obelisks to purify water, using specifically the nodes of the longitudinal array. So the nodes of your major electrogravitic or electroculture devices should begin to understand the local longitudinal array. So then you do some geobiology and some dowsing, and you're essentially amplifying the charge distribution in the local grid. And another perfect parallel to this was, you know, where we discovered Agnihotra in Poland, all the farms nearby were deserts, and that farm was a blooming Garden of Eden. The difference was Agnihotra. So that's another example of amplifying the longitudinal array. And all these things fit together once you understand the fractality of the coherent longitudinal array versus electrogravitics and electroculture.
Thank you, Dan. These were all the questions so far.
So was that a happily ever after to our story? So just coming back to where we started with this, do you see that the brainwave cascade, when it implodes, makes you centripetal and you become the gravity maker? And ultimately, if you're not a gravity maker, you will be pushed around. Another way of saying that is, until you have your own source of bliss, which means your own source of charge, which means your own source of implosion, until then, you are by definition a parasite. You are getting your charge from outside you instead of inside you. So the definition of the origin of self-empowerment is specifically the charge vortex imploding, which is the subject of today's conversation. Do you see why, does the CIA want you to know how electrogravitics work? No. But does the CIA want you to understand how your mind works? Oops. You can't know the one without the other. And this is the point I'm making, that until you know the origin of one centripetal force, you cannot know the origin of all centripetal forces. And I say, because physics on this planet does not know the cause of anything centripetal, that we as a planet will be primitive and drive around in cars powered by dinosaurs farting until the day we know the origin of centripetal forces. That's why I say you, for yourself, need to know how a charged vortex makes gravity. Like carbon nanomaterials, rotating conjugators like fullerene can make gravity and make a kind of propulsion which makes every other form of transport on this planet look like the Stone Ages. And we have a group that's doing that work. And this all begins with understanding how a charged vortex makes gravity. So that's why I thought it was important to retell this story tonight. And I hope we had visuals that were clear. And as we said, if you understood how implosion makes gravity, and you described this accurately enough, your 5-year-old should be able to explain the cause of gravity. And this should, I hope, embarrass their physics teacher. So in the hope of embarrassing your school's physics teacher, I am signing off and saying, like, if they don't know why objects fall to the ground, they should not be teaching physics to kids. Sorry. Tell them to learn first. This is my humble opinion. Anyway, I hope you had fun tonight. Any final questions? Are we good?
Yeah, just one last question. When you make gravity, you control wind, weather, rain, or is that why?
We were back in the gorge in the ravine one day, and I was telling Valeria how you use a pine cone to make rain. And I picked up a beautiful pine cone. I held it by the tip, and you could see the cloud peaks immediately begin to form. So the origin of centripetal force is the reason a child focusing in a cloud will make a hole in that cloud. It's called the physics of precipitation, not just in how to make rain, but it's called the physics of precipitation in the physics of magic literature. So what is precipitating here is the origin of all centripetal forces. So thank you very much. I hope you had fun tonight. And next week we
Thanks so
will
much,
have
Dan.
our Bucky Fuller person coming next week with two fine guests. So thanks for joining us
Casey
tonight.
House.
Casey, how
See you next week.
See you next week.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hope you have fun.
Love and blessings. Mwah.
Bye, Russ. Nice to see you. Thank you. Bye, everybody. See you later. Was great. Bye.